I tried to let it in and set it free. It wallows still, consuming me. Yo, what's going on? It's someone that's no one, and welcome back to today's report. Today's report was sent in by James. When this happened, 2014, the drugs used were mushrooms, Liberty Cap specifically, cannabis, and nicotine at a dose of 6.5 grams, 1.5 grams initially, and 5 grams later on. The route of administration was orally and smoked. Gender, male. Weight, 142.8 pounds. Age, 18. Height, 5'6". Prior experience, he notes, before this experience took place, I had taken LSD, mushrooms, N-bomb, DMT, salvia, bromo dragonfly, 2CB, 2CE, weed, and a collection of other drugs not worth mentioning. And for his set, he notes that Set was curious and arrogant, but with a desire to explore. I was high, but the aim was to achieve a spiritual experience. So this is definitely a heroic dose, and the experience definitely becomes very intense and pretty much all over the place, as you will see. The weed that was smoked most likely did have an impact on his experience, but at 6.5 grams, you're going to be tripping pretty hard regardless. So this one is a bit longer. I hope you guys enjoy this one, and without further ado, let's dive right into it. Intro and setting. A few years ago, in the garage at my grandma's house in Scotland, it was a cold, dark, and quiet winter night. I sat with my two friends, who we'll call Alec and John. Hour 1. We were smoking some Trainwreck cannabis, and this stuff was highly potent. I suggested that one of my friends and I take 1.5 grams of dried Liberty Caps each. We smoked weed for a starter by rolling ridiculous-sized joints. Then we took the shrooms, and within an hour of taking them, I started tripping and began to feel perplexed. Back then, I could always compose myself, and I always helped my friends who got too messed up. And so, I convinced myself that this tiny dosage was only going to give me some minor visuals and maybe some insights. But no, you see, combined with blunts and joints of potent cannabis, it took me towards level 3. I was able to control my thoughts, but I was very suspicious as to why I was tripping more intensely than expected. My other friend kept asking why we were acting weird, but every time he did, it would snap me out of the trip, and I would act normal for a few minutes. Later, I discovered I had been judging my dosage based on a much weaker mushroom, the cubensis. Hour 2. My non-tripping friend left, and this is when I ran upstairs after suggesting we take 5 grams out of false bravado, as if to say, oh, that 1.5 grams was nothing. Anyway, I go upstairs and weigh out 5 grams each for me and Alec, go downstairs, and we both finish the shrooms while watching some documentary. While waiting on the effects, I feel them creep up on me, and after only 10 minutes, my vision becomes comprised of complex geometry. My skin is flushed, and my heart was beating faster than normal. The intense sedation and intense hallucinations set in shortly after. At this part of the trip, I was enjoying how intense the hallucinations were. The air in the room seemed to take on a liquid form, comprised of interlocking patterns that vibrated erratically. I would wave my hand and see it disturbing all the particles around me. It was as if every wall and every object was alive. Everything was swirling, and at points, the air looked like writing, which was sort of guiding me through the trip. I looked at my friend and demanded he changed what we were watching. I didn't want to watch some documentary that was basically incomprehensible while tripping this hard, so I put on The Simpsons, and I looked at him and asked, "Are you feeling this yet?" He said no, and I remember this made me feel alone on this super intense come-up. Hour 3. I was approaching ego death, and I could not put together any of my thoughts or memories, so I just closed my eyes and traveled into a virtual world, filled with neon green lights and black space. Behind it, I was a player in this game, and I was moving rapidly through it as if I was swimming through consciousness. Looking back on this was in an episode of Dexter's Laboratory I seen as a kid. Soon after that, I opened my eyes as I start to remember what's going on. I notice that I am looking down on myself, floating above my body as if I'm a player in a video game. I tried to look at my friend, and he said something to me which sounded like nothing I had ever heard before. The only way I can describe it is it's as if he spoke in every language at the same time. His voice sped up, slowed down, and then sped back up. I kept saying, "What?" And I then realized that I am stuck in a loop. It felt like an eternity. This is when shit gets weird. The loss of visual connection to reality was so severe that everything looked exactly like The Simpsons. I looked at my friend, and his face was transforming into all the characters from the show at once on a continuous cycle. Mumbled voices of Bart, Lisa, Homer, and Marge filled my mind. Their voices made a trippy, distorted anti-melody, and although this was utter chaos, every sense in my body was hallucinating in a pattern of sorts. My vision completely shifted, and I was now physically seeing the world in 2D. As strange as this sounds to a non-tripper, it was even stranger to the tripper. I was in the Simpsons cartoon, and my sense of reality, time, and humanity are gone. I know not of time. I'm starting to shake. My hallucinations at this point are indescribable. I somehow stand up rapidly and begin to walk as if everything in my visual field is falling away from me. It was as if I was on a sinking ship. Suddenly, I felt a painful electric shock, and my brain gets a sudden jolt. My pineal gland felt as though it had just exploded, and an all-encompassing sound arose as my ears popped. Somehow, I pull through and get into my house. I go upstairs to take a piss, end up knocking a few things over, and then remember my grandma is sleeping. Somehow, I was thinking a little more with clarity at that point. I then went downstairs, sat down by my back door, smoked a cigarette, and tried to cope with the idea of tripping in my freezing garage for hours on a level 5 approaching trip. I remember looking at my backyard as if it was a digital alien world. As I looked up, there were visuals of geometric spider webs all around me. I was in a sort of dome, and everything was electric and pulsating. If I stared at anything for too long, I would get stuck in. What appeared to me as a mixture of all senses would turn into some random nonsensical plot, like a cartoon, and as I viewed it, it would pulsate through my body. I remembered my friend was still waiting for me in the garage, so I go back in. I start to smell burning, and I alert my friend, who says nothing is wrong. I tried to look at the heater that was on, but couldn't see if it had melted the plastic or not. My vision was playing way too many tricks on me. I ask him if his shrooms have kicked in yet, and he says no. This is beginning to mess with my trip. I couldn't understand how I was so fucked up, and he wasn't. I tried to sit there and pretend I wasn't about to trip out, and this created thought loops, and along with the coldness of the garage, with great guilt, I tell him I'm going in the house, and he needs to leave as I'm approaching a level 5 trip. I couldn't concentrate on my body temperature. He tried to make me feel guilty, and understandably so. I mean, I had just given him 6.5 grams and told him to walk home, but I had to get out of the cold. I hope he made it home safe, and I nearly went back out to get him, but luckily he didn't start tripping until he made it home. As he walked away from my house, I started getting very paranoid. For one, he could get hit by a car or something, and two, because I felt like he knew I had just acted like a pussy that couldn't handle my shrooms. Along with this realization, I thought that everything in my head had been public all along. Every secret I held, every bad thing I'd done was obvious all along. The privacy I thought I had was an illusion. As I fell deeper into the abyss, my mind tried to fight against it. I ran upstairs as quickly as possible before I wasn't able to walk. I remember I looked into my room and was frozen in shock as there appeared to be a full-sized jaguar sitting on my couch. It growled at me and began to come towards me. I immediately turned on the lights and realized that it was just my jacket. I then tried to leave the light on, but the visuals were making me extremely dizzy, so I shut off the lights and curled into the fetal position on my bed. My recollection at this point was hazy, because this is where my trip had peaked. As I laid in the darkness, my body and mind seemed to slide away even further, and the hallucinations were getting very sinister. I see shadow people, and every time I try to glance straight at them, they appear to be running away from my line of vision. Imagine you see someone running around the corner of a building with a flashlight on them. Their shadow gets taller, then it disappears. That is what I was seeing. I heard unintelligible voices seemingly trying to contact me. All 5 of my senses seemed to have become one. I began to think that I had picked the wrong mushrooms. This trip felt more like a poisoning than psychedelic. My room was covered in faces, not actual faces, but expressions of disgust and entities that seemed to toy with me. Whenever I got scared, they would laugh at me. I was listening to the Aphex Twin song Window Licker before this trip, and I remember hearing it play on repeat. At one part of the song, the creepiest part of the song, I heard it clear as day, not just when you hear something in your head, but as if it was actually playing. As I lied there in pure terror, eventually my body goes cold and my chest tightens. I began to choke. My esophagus was completely dry, then everything disappears. Desperately wanting to live, I sat up quickly, ran to my bathroom, and drank as much water as I could before running back to bed. I considered phoning an ambulance, but luckily I didn't have to resort to that. But whenever I have such bad trips, it's always in the back of my mind. As I desperately tried to grasp onto what was left of my reality, I kept tensing my muscles to make sure I was still there. My bed covers felt like they were a part of my body. I had completely lost myself. There was no self anymore. I tried to think of my family and friends, and every time I did, I could only think of the feeling they gave me. I was having distorted and weird visions as I tried to remember who I was and where my place in the world was. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that I was born into this family with this mom, this grandma, and so on. Why aren't I an insect, fish, or animal? This sounds stupid, I know, but while tripping this heavily, you realize how very weird all of that is. All I envisioned was mysterious, unrecognizable worlds with strange dialogues. With my eyes closed, I was falling down a black hole filled with images of distorted parts of who I think I am, fading from real to bizarre, like complete distortions of everything imaginable. I could travel back to the old and sometimes random times in my life. It was not so much an actual memory, but more like a roller coaster of feelings, expressions, and clips or random periods. Suddenly, everything faded to black. Everything I was struggling to grasp onto didn't matter. This is it, I thought. I had done it this time. I was dead. I had forgotten I was on a drug, and everything I knew about my life slipped away. I then envisioned that I was a fetus. Am I in the womb? I see my entire life flash before my eyes. I am born. I am in my nursery. I am at school. I am in high school. I am in college. I am at my first job. Everything in my life was just relived up until the point I took the Liberty caps. As the psilocybin left my body, I remembered who I was again. I felt as if I had been reborn in every sense. I would describe this trip as terrifying and thought that there would be lasting, detrimental mental effects. As soon as the shrooms leave your body, though, they're gone. It's not like acid, where you still get slight visuals afterwards, perhaps because mushrooms are a natural hallucinogen. This trip report doesn't convey the real emotional roller coaster that I went on, but to this day, thinking about it still gives me fear. I'm still trying to make sense of what that was. I don't think I will ever know. What did I learn from this experience? The mind is extremely powerful. There's something beyond this world. I accepted my own death. Life is the real trip. Never again will I take or have ever taken such dosages in bad conditions. I stopped smoking cigarettes for a while after this trip and stopped drinking as much. I've cut down on cannabis consumption as well. I will never ego dose again. It's helped me create psychedelic effects in my music and has driven most of my work in university. I now only use them in spiritual settings, and I'm a solo tripper. I will only sometimes trip with one other trusted friend. I have been trying to pursue a career in music and make psychedelic music and videos, and I am certain that my life work will be adding to both the psychedelic community and music scene in some way.